it's very difficult to underestimate the amount of human motivation that's embedded in the attempt to alleviate suffering, to eradicate disease, to help people live a healthy life, and well, that's the disease, obviously, but to live a long life as well, and to make things as peaceful as possible. I mean, you can be cynical about people, and you can talk about them as motivated by power and being corrupt and all of those things, and all of those things are true, but you shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater, because we have been striving for a very long time to set things right, and we've done actually not too bad a job of it for half-starving, crazy, insect-ridden chimpanzees with lifespans of 50 to 70 years. So, you know, we could deserve a bit of sympathy for our position as far as I'm concerned. So, some other representations. This one I like, the one on the left. That's paradise. Paradise as a walled garden, and that's what paradise means. It's paradisa, which is, I don't remember the language. It's associated with Persian. Paradisa means walled garden. And why a walled garden? Well, it goes back to the chaos order idea. So this is where God puts man and woman after the creation in a walled garden. Well, the wall is culture and order, and the garden is nature. And the idea is the proper human habitat is nature and culture in balance. It's, well, we like gardens. Well, why? Because, well, they're not completely covered with weeds and mosquitoes and black flies, right? So they're civilized a little bit, but still within that civilization, nature in its more benevolent guise is encouraged to flourish, and people find that rejuvenating. And so the idea that paradise, the proper habitat of a human being, is a walled garden is a good one. And it's walled because, well, you want to keep things out, right? I mean, raccoons, for example, you want to keep those things out, man, even though it's impossible. And, you know, you don't want, well, there's all sorts of things you don't want in your garden, like snakes. Walls don't seem to be much use against them. But the idea that paradise is a walled garden is an echo back to the chaos order idea. Walls, culture, right? Garden, nature. So the proper human habitat is a properly tended garden. Now, the radical left-leaning, anti-theist environmentalists tend to make the case that the predations of the Western capitalist system are a consequence of the injunction that was delivered in Genesis by God to man to go out and dominate the earth. David Suzuki has talked a lot about this, by the way. They believe that that statement has given rise to our inappropriate assumption that we have the right to exert control over the world, and that that's what's turned us into these terrible predatory monsters, sometimes described as cancers on the face of the earth, or viruses that have inhabited the entire ecosystem, who are doing nothing but wandering everywhere and wreaking havoc as rapidly as we possibly can, which is another perspective on the essential element of humankind that I find absolutely deplorable. I mean, if you look at the historical record, for example, even casually, you'll find out that as late as the late 1800s, 1895 thereabouts, Thomas Huxley, who was Aldous Huxley's grandfather and a great defender of Darwin, prepared a report for the British government on ocean sustainability. And his conclusion was, fish away, guys, man. There's so many fish out there. The oceans are so inexhaustible that no matter how hard humanity tried for any number of years, the probability that we could do more than put a dent in what was out there was zero. Now, Huxley turned out to be wrong. He didn't realize that our population was going to spike so dramatically, partly because we got a little bit rich and our children stopped dying at the rate of like 60% before they were 1 year old. And, you know, we actually managed to populate the earth with a few people, but it wasn't really until 1960 or so that we woke up to the fact that there were so many of us that we actually had to start paying attention to what we were doing to the planet. And that's like, what, 50 years ago? Well, we've just started to develop the technology, the wherewithal to understand that the whole world might be well considered a garden, and we need to live inside the proper balance between culture and order, or culture and chaos. Before that, we were spending all of our time just trying not to die, and usually very unsuccessfully. So I don't agree with that interpretation of the opening sections of Genesis. I don't believe that it's given human beings the right to act as super predators on the planet. I think that instead the proper environment for human beings is presented quite properly as a garden, and that the role of people, and that's explicitly stated in the second story in Adam and Eve, was to tend the garden. And that means to make the proper decisions and to make sure that everything thrives and flourishes, and so that it's good for the things that are living there that aren't just people, but also good for the people too. So fine, I think we could at least note that that's a slightly different take on the story than the ultimately cynical interpretation that's so commonly put forward today. Now, inside that walled garden is a couple of trees, and Adam and Eve and some animals and all of that. And unfortunately, the tree happens to have a snake wrapped around it. Now, that's an interesting thing. We're going to talk about that a lot. And the snake in both of these representations, this is no ordinary snake. Say it's got a human head, and it's got a human head there too. So whatever that snake is, well, forget about looking at this from a religious perspective. Like, if you can, just imagine that you're an anthropologist and you've never seen this image before. It's like, what do you see? Well, you see walls, and you see a fairly pleasant enclosure, and then you see a tree, and people are eating from the tree, but the tree has a snake in it that has a human head. And so then you might think, well, what's a snake with a human head? And then you'd think, well, it's half snake and half human. That's hardly revelatory. It's just self-evident. So whatever that snake is isn't just a snake. It's snake and human. Or it's snake and partakes in whatever human beings are. And that's very important. So we'll consider that later. And you see the same thing here. And you see in this particular version, there's the head. This one also has wings. And so this is a winged snake, sort of like a dragon. And so it crawls on the ground like a reptile, and it's got an aerial aspect or a spiritual aspect. So here it's a snake, which is like the lowest form of reptilian life, say, something that crawls on the ground. It's something that's human and something that's spiritual at the same time. And it inhabits the tree, which looked a lot like magic mushrooms, by the way. And you can look that up if you want. That's quite an interesting little rabbit hole to wander down if you're curious about it. But there's an idea here too, is that there was something in the garden at the beginning of time that was like a snake, that was like a person, that was like something that was winged. It was something spiritual. So it's spiritual, human, and reptilian all at the same time. And it's the animating spirit of the tree. Okay, so keep that in mind. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. This is in relationship to Genesis 1, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So that's wisdom in that one too, I think, the idea of the Sabbath, because one of the things, I've worked with a lot of people who were hyper-conscientious, and the thing about hyper-conscientious people is that they'll just work till they die. And that's actually not very productive, because then they're dead and they can't work. And so what you have to do with hyper-conscientious people is you have to say, well, I know you'd rather do nothing but work, and maybe you're just as guilty as you can possibly be when you're not working, but let's figure out what you're up to. And what you're up to, in all probability, is the attempt to be productive in the least problematic, longest sustaining possible manner. And that might mean you have to take a rest. And so one of the things I used to work with lawyers, with people who had risen to the top of large law firms, and they were hyper-productive types, and they were often, trying to hit their impossible quota for yearly hours, and burning themselves to a frazzle as a consequence. And one of the things that we used to do was, they couldn't work fewer hours, because a day that just didn't work. But what we did was we have them take more time off, like a 4-day weekend every 2 months or something, that was plotted out into the future. And then we track their billable hours, which is their degree of productivity, and it would actually increase. So that was so cool, because you could take hardworking people and you could say, look, take a break. Why? Well, because you'll be more productive if you take a break. No, that couldn't possibly be. Like, I should just work flat out all the time. It's like, let's test that out and take a break now and then. It's like, well, what happened was their productivity would increase, often by 10%. So there's wisdom here too, which is okay. And this alludes to the Adam and Eve story near the end. You're self-conscious, you discover the future, you have to work. Well, then the question is, how much should you work? And one answer is, you better bloody well work all the time, because no matter how much work you do, you're not solving your problems. They're coming along, man. And you can stack up all the money you want, you can stack up all the wealth you want. It is not going to protect you in the final analysis. So you better be hitting the ground running, and you better run flat out all the time. Well, what happens if you do that? Well, then you die. It's not a good solution. So maybe you should rest. And so How does that rest get instantiated? Well, it's not easy to tell, but one way to do it, let's say conceptually, is to say, look, even God had to rest 1 day a week. And so you don't have to be so presumptuous to assume that if God had to rest 1 day a week, that maybe, you are allowed to work nonstop without a break at all.